Welcome back to episode 169 of the Block Runner Podcast. I'm your host, William, always here with your co-host, Iman.
What's going on, dude?
And on the sticks, we got TJ.
Hello.
And finally, we get Benny, the dev from Trac, on the call with us. Thank you for joining us, Benny.
Hi, thanks for having me. How are you doing?
No, good, man.
Doing
I'm
good.
so glad to talk to you, man. So just to kind of kick off the conversation, we've been kind of conversating, kind of like in the DMs, just talking about bitmaps.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to get you on the podcast to talk about TAP protocol, these TAP punks that we've been hearing about.
Yeah.
Talk about the future of bitmaps.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of different like verticals we can go down because I think so. We're both builders in this Ordinals bitmap space and BRC20, whatever. This whole building on Bitcoin movement thing that's happening.
Yeah,
we're all deeply invested and interested in this, and I think you have a much I think deeper root than us because we were mostly observers in this Bitcoin space up until bitmap happened.
Yeah.
Right? Then we found like a personal, I guess, attachment to something of substance within this whole Ordinals ecosystem, right? But correct me if I'm not mistaken, your origins go all the way back to Rarity Garden and Lux Ordinal. You have several projects that you've been cooking up. So I guess if you can, just kind of like run us down like a history, like of the lore of Benny, you know, what got you interested in this space?
Yes.
And
Okay. Yeah, so well, it goes even further back. I also started off as a Solidity Ethereum developer, right?
Okay.
So I'm more or less since 2018 developing with Solidity on Ethereum. I went through all the bull market, bear market traps. I wanted to say bull traps, but went through all the bear. But it was a really great time to learn all that stuff. And at some point, then when the bull market started, I got interested in the NFT space because my professional origin has always been content management, right? So. That is where I personally basically started, right? Being a developer. And so that caught my attention because a lot of what was going on back at that time remembered me a lot of the beginning of basically content management on the web, Web 2, you can even say Web 1, right? So and I realized that there's a lot of things are cross-secting there, and a lot of tools are missing, right? So then I went further down that route and did also some, I would say, first mover things back then, right? But then PFPs came. So, and then, that's from there, in my opinion, sorry to be that honest, things went downhill. The entire space got extremely quickly thrown under the bus through streamlined NFT, PFP schemes, right? Yes. So, it was nuts. There was obviously a big money behind it, and you had zero chance to come up with something new. Everybody wanted to have PFPs, the same streamlined types of collectibles, and even respectable artists, right? Who really like wanted to get into that game. They didn't get hurt, right? So complete Deegan play, right? Of course, and was not so my thing, but still I was keep developing throughout the current bear market, right? And on Rarity Garden, and was about to develop actually I stopped developing that when I heard about Ordinals developing on EVM chain based multi-chain marketplaces, right? So a lot of the things that you see within Trac was covered there as well, but not as fleshed out. But I took many of these aspects over from there. But when I heard about Ordinals, it was in February this year. I mean, was a super strong narrative, right? Affordable provenance right on the Bitcoin chain, right? So affordable data storage up to 400 kilobytes and even more. It's possible. It was a no-brainer, right? So I was looking into that, and I was pretty quickly consumed by it. I started with onboarding, started to help onboarding people into the space back then when there really was just the Ordinals Discord existing, right? People came in, and then was the only way you could inscribe something was actually using the Ord wallet. You really needed a node for that. It was not easy for people. And helped onboarding, I think it was around about 80 people that there were a lot more people, helped onboarding. At the same time, it helped also securing the Bitcoin network, because there are more nodes started to run at that time. Even about all this criticism from Maxis and things like that, they can agree that this is not really a bad thing, right? If your network is getting stronger, yeah. In that sense, it's not miners actually, right? Just miners that are doing that, but people who have completely different interests. And then from there, basically moved on. I got requests. Hey, how can we do mass minting? I created a free console-based mass minting tool that was built for the actual Ord wallet. People were using that for a few weeks. Then I met Super Testnet there. You probably know that guy, right? And he pointed me to an inscription tool that was web-based, because I got requests basically, hey, can't you do that in a web app? What you're doing here, it's easier to do, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And Super Testnet had something like this, but was only one inscription at a time. So I got in touch with him. We worked then for some time together. So I extended that inscription tool and made it like a mass inscription tool, added more and more features, right? And from that looks ordinal, right? Spun, right? So that was great at the time. Now it's more like a pro tool. It still has a lot of, the development keeps going. Still a lot of features, but it's not like for the absolute beginner, right? This isn't a tool where you really need to know what you're doing, because it's self-custodial. And then at some point, what was keep developing my stuff for Rarity Gun, and I noticed then when the Ordinal space started to first time to really kick off, that all the available API endpoints that were available until this point suddenly stopped working. So it was one by one, pop, 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 pop. Was just gone, right?
Yeah.
There wasn't even a paid alternative or something like that, right? So figured then what happened is everybody started to disconnect themselves from the outside world to manage their stuff and exclusively their stuff. So that got me thinking, probably not so good idea in an emerging market. The first thing you are doing is to cut yourself off from the outside world, right? You're cutting off developers, you're cutting off consumers, you're cutting basically everybody off. I know the intention behind it, I can understand it. In certain cases, it was surely necessary because of server loads and stuff like that. And then I realized very quickly, also when I released, for example, a loot for Taproot collection that was actually worked together back then with the guys from the loot projects themselves, themselves. I realized with that project, okay, that goes a little bit too far. We need indexing here, right? So, but certain aspects that were required back then was already cut off to achieve that, indexing and tracking. And then BRC20 came, and everybody is literally got into it. I was like everybody else, just fun inscribing all sorts of tickers, right? So and then I raised the question in Vertigan, hey, we need tracking, right? So what if I just deploy a token, right? And if that mints out, it's just like a vote on tracking, independent tracking needs to exist, and something like that needs to show up. And got minted out quickly, which was really great. And from there, basically the main focus for now is Trac. Yeah, although it's part of this broader Vertigan thing, because the point is, I personally need Trac, the technology, the product, myself, to be able to move on with the parent project, which is Vertigan, right? So, so and then it naturally evolved to what it is right now, and it's evolving even further, in the future. To a point, and that's what I always said, is to a point where Trac, the product, will be released for the public as an open source project. And then there will be a Trac entity that handles that. And there will be Trac the token, which is, as it turned out, now the governance token. And these three parts are intertwined, but they are also its own thing, right? In some sense. And from that moment on, when this is like an open source project, I will be just a developer like anyone else. And then the idea is then basically that I can get back to the projects and the stuff that I have to manage in other areas, right? Benny, so, and yeah.
Can you explain basically why an indexer is so important for the Ordinals ecosystem?
Yeah, so we don't have smart contracts, but nevertheless, we want smart contract-like behavior. For we want to make sense of things. Sure, provenance is one thing, but you want to take bitmap, for example. You want the simplest thing you can imagine is tracking who was the first of the same inscription, right? So that's the most basic thing you can actually do. That requires already tracking. BRC20 account balancing, right? Sure, you can write that all. You can write that all on chain, but with a smart contract, it's impossible with smart contracts to give this life meaning, and certain algorithms, right, that you just need you just cannot execute them. And so the idea with tracking is basically that you specify specs of how the rule set for tracking should be. You flesh these out. Then you still operate with these rules on what is written on chain. You're not coming up with stuff out of thin air, right? So the traces of what are in these rule sets are laid out are on chain. It's just about the rules, how to read them, what to do them, and things like that. And that differs then vastly, of course, from how smart contracts work. And it's of course just similar to to identify the state of what this particular asset you are tracking is in. But that is as close as we can get to smart contract for tracking, and that's why it's so important. If you look at things natively, you can of course come up with different layers, right? You can say, okay, I have a side chain, L2 chain, whatever, right? Put that somewhere else and care from there, right? But then it's not native anymore. You will always have this gap, Ord wallet, and your solution, because the Ord wallet itself is already an index, right? It has its own index, pulls the data from chain, gives it meaning, which inscription is actually a valid inscription, puts that in its own index. That's basically index 0, right? So And since it started off like that, in my opinion, and that's what Trac comes into play, you should continue with that principle. Yeah. But in a way that enables you to keep decentralization. Yeah. So and that is the idea then behind Trac. That is then solving this issue. You have reliable tracking. You have it decentralized. You can expand on existing data that somebody else has previously through his rule sets achieved, and then move on with working through more. Yeah. So basically creating more out of the rule sets of others. So you're basically the idea is that you are able to compose and build on the shoulders of others. Yeah.
Okay. So let me explain this so that the audience is like following here. So basically the way that Bitcoin ordinals work is you have essentially, if you're a project, you have to basically have like a Bitcoin core, and that core is all about sending Satoshis to each other in a completely decentralized way, right? Then on top of that, there's this thing called Ordinals client, which runs on top of the core. And the Ordinals client its job is to assign an ID to each of the Satoshis. And so by assigning an ID to a Satoshi, you're making Satoshis non-fungible, right? Because your ID for a Satoshi is different than my ID. My ID might have an inscription of a picture, and you might think that's valuable. So my Satoshi is valued differently than your Satoshi, right? So non-fungible, right?
Yeah.
And when it comes to projects building ordinals like Trac or Bitmap or anything, you essentially have to come up with these meta protocols that indexers have to support. So say, for example, you come up with this idea called bitmaps. It's supposed to be this decentralized like metaverse ecosystem where every block represents a district and the transactions represent parcels. There has to be an indexer involved here to be able to have a parent-child inscription process to be able to inscribe a parcel of the parent inscription bitmap, right? And so I think that's the kind of like the uniqueness of like ordinals right now, because we have to get projects like Trac involved to say, hey, Trac, I need you to index, this portion so that I can, show my users, this particular aspect of the project. And without tracking or without indexing, you cannot do that, right? So indexing represents like a critical piece of like the whole ordinals ecosystem. So Benny, how do you envision Trac being a way for developers to be able to track their own sort of like pseudo meta protocols using Trac?
Yeah, and also to add on top of that, because how do we get assurance on as far as like the reliability of what it is that individual indexers or I guess truth providers, I guess I would kind of the way I understand it.
Yeah.
What's the way to validate what it is that people are indexing is true? For us outside, I guess, users.
Yeah, there are different approaches in that matter. But to answer the first question, the idea is, especially for Trac, that this is a developer ecosystem. So we focus on projects and the developers, and they will be able to basically download from GitHub different types of packages for different types of use cases. This goes from standard ordinals tracking, where just the ordinals themselves are tracked, right? So which one exists, then can go so far to actual bitmap parceling, right? So and these are like packages that Trac will initially put out, right? But developers are invited to expand on them, and then through pull requests, right, to include them, and then through some further process that I will introduce with further development, they will be included in the for now working title is network marketplace. Yeah, where then hopefully an ecosystem starts to evolve where the different developers and track service providers can basically promote and show their solutions for what they made, what trackers they made, and make it public and earn money with it, right? Or not, yeah. That's something. How you would get access to that, and additionally on top, of course, you need to have a source of indexing, and these are a special type of peers within Trac, that you can run that are beefier. They're most comparable to, I would say, to something like a validator node. Yeah. Okay. They are basically at the core, at the base of the data. Yeah. They read from the Ord wallet. And these are treated in a special way, and for these there are incentives supposed to be worked on. I'm not 100% clear yet, how these incentives will look like. I have various ideas about that, but that will be solved too. And the thing with validating that is that these when you basically consume data from, let's say, from somebody else's work, right? So he's basically a writer, then he's also part of a mesh, and of a mesh of different participants in that Trac network. So when you have that writer, the idea is basically to say that for the same inputs you need to have the same outputs. So there's this thing that these writers can actually cross-check between themselves, horizontally and periodically, if the results, if the input delivers the same results. And at the moment, I'm tending to say it's like a 51% thing. So if 51%, right? So come to the same agreement, then the exacting peer party knows that he can trust it, right? That's one thing to achieve that when it comes to writers. When you use the actual verified data, then you will always need to have something to prove to the consumer that this was right. So the consumer also, I haven't implemented that, but it will be working like this, can actively, from his position, check if the data at any time that he gets is consistent with the rest of the network, what the rest of the network has. Yeah. So, and since this is not a blockchain, right? This is basically a way to achieve that within the Trac network. And then recently, I got in touch with, not really in touch. I had a discussion with somebody on Twitter. I forgot his name, but it was very interesting with this internet computer thing that actually, it was a good idea to make indexers being the provers. Yeah, so it can even spin further from there. You can make Trac or any other indexer, in some shape or form resilient against all sorts of different attacks from within the network. But in the end, it can also prove to some other instance of, let's say ICP being a prover, and then all these different indexers can meet at one place and prove actually their outcomes. So but that also means that the entire tracking and indexing space is still, and it requires a lot of continuous work, a lot of continuous experimenting, a lot of continued research, right? So for now, the part about Trac that is working is that it's decentralized data distribution. Yeah. So you can create already all sorts of different types of meshes within that Trac network and secure them against each other, right? So if you are at the point when you want to compare that with data from other indexes, then there needs to be a layer on top of for that. I mean, such an example could be Alex Labs, for example. I think it's a similar way how it's supposed to work, right? But that would be a way where the different indexes can meet and get some additional layer of verification.
So Benny, let me see if I understand this. So for Trac, what you're doing is essentially you're indexing everything associated to ordinals. So basically, anything that's happened on chain before December of last year, that information is not accessible through Trac. Is that correct?
Everything that happened before December last year is available to Trac. Yes.
Okay. So okay. So then what information, because December marks the point of ordinals, right? When Casey Ronimer came up with the ordinal theory.
And I guess the introduction of inscriptions, right?
The introduction of inscriptions. So the data before that point, you're just you have the information of all of the Bitcoin block data, like accessible, like ready to query. Is that correct? Am I understanding that?
Trac tracks from the beginning of ordinals, not the entire Bitcoin history.
Okay, that's what I was asking. Okay, so
yeah, it's definitely possible. Yeah. We partially did that with the Bitmap project,
yes,
obviously.
Correct.
But it can do that, yeah. So,
okay.
But the focus mainly is on ordinals.
Okay.
Yeah?
The reason,
of course, we can do that, yeah.
Yeah, because let's say there's a project on ordinals, and we sort of talked about this in one of our previous videos called DMT, Digital Matter Theory, where you can extract the data from Bitcoin's blockchain to inscribe BRC20s, and so what we would need in order to do that is the ability to query the blockchain data to discover a pattern, right? To discover some sort of pattern. Like one pattern could be how many times did a transaction of above 10,000 Bitcoin occur, right? And so we need some sort of database in order to index this information. Did you know that we're more than just a YouTube channel? We also built Mscribe, the first inscription platform built from the ground up for the metaverse on Bitcoin. Connect your Bitmap ordinals and use our tools to bring your community into the virtual realm. Support us by joining the movement at mscribe.io. Like, comment, and subscribe for the latest alpha. Back to the video. And let's assume that it only occurred 1,000 times. That means the max supply or the available supply of this token would be 1,000. But I don't think there's a place for us to extract that information yet. So this is a different service basically than what Trac is currently doing. Is that correct, Benny?
This is something that is completely different from what is available now.
Okay, that's I'm just trying to confirm.
Yeah,
okay,
but it can be added for sure. I mean, somebody can create a writer that goes through the entire blockchain history, records the data, and tries to find patterns. I mean, there is a plugin system involved with Trac, where I could see this working, for example, in finding patterns, right? Where you basically check the different outcomes, different blocks.
Yeah, I guess I'm not trying to get too deep into like pattern recognition stuff in this conversation. I'm just trying to understand in like my mind, like how all this, like what exactly Trac is doing. And so Trac focuses on the inception of ordinals and forward, right? If a project like Bitmap needs access to like previous data, then yeah, you can support that. But ultimately Trac is about like inscriptions and then moving forward. Anything that you come up with that, like BRC20s, you know, any flavor of a fungible token on top of that, that is all like what Trac does, all ordinals focused.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
All things ordinal. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so can you explain exactly what the TAP protocol is and like the extension to the BRC20 that you did release recently?
Yeah. The TAP protocol is basically for now a slight modification of the BRC20 protocol. Slight in the sense that it extends with a token send function, right? That enables you to do mass sending of tokens within the TAP protocol, which is what I call an internal function. Then you have external functions that behave exactly in the same way like BRC20. And the intention behind this is that I was looking at the different projects, right? How and the demands of people that are looking to have something like a not even necessarily DeFi, but at least something that makes their life easier in terms of functionality, and without making it too complex by introducing new technologies, layers on top, and things like that. And I developed that idea earlier already, before Bitmap, where you can basically achieve something like that, but you need to have you will need to have basically new protocol for that, to do that. And but at the same time, I'm a huge fan of BRC20, right?
Yeah.
So, and I don't want to replace anything there. So and then the idea came up to have this tap protocol and exclude on purpose the ticker lengths that are usually inscribed for BRC20, which are 1, 2, and 4, and the rest is then available in basically within the token side of the TAP protocol. The TAP protocol is supposed to be extendable through governance, community governance, and not necessarily just about tokens. Yeah, so token is now one thing that is being addressed first, and it can also be including different aspects, yeah, within Ordinals. So, for example, governance itself is being planned to be implemented within TAP. Yeah, that's a non-balance token balance changing a part of the protocol, right? So, but it has of course some touch point with tokens, but it's not about tokens themselves. That's why you have, for example, when you deploy a token within TAP, you have a token minus prefix. So, and any further updates, functions, additional functions will have their own prefix. Yeah, and as I said, it's not necessarily about tokens, but that's how it started. Yeah.
So why was it necessary to do a TAP protocol rather than like an extended functionality of a BRC20 token? Like why is there that distinction?
For me personally, the main distinction was that I need to I have ideas, for example, that I would like to showcase to the community that I surely know won't even consider it on the BRC20 side, and somebody else is working on the BRC20 side, right?
Okay.
There is, from my point of, at the moment, it's a rigid thing. I know there's development there, but at the moment it's a rigid thing. At some point there will be updates, but I want to introduce new things now, not in 6 months.
I see.
Not in 2 years, now. So, and ideally, I want to introduce these to the community. And if the community says, "Okay, this is a cool idea, let's do it," they can vote on that. Then they can vote on the implementation, and then it makes it into the TAP protocol. And that is something that I just don't see happening with BRC20. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just trying to understand. So BRC20s, clearly there's people working on BRC20s, and doesn't it come down to like the indexer doing the functionality? Like, remember how you were saying that we all would like smart contract functionality on top of Bitcoin, but there is no smart contract. So instead we have to rely on indexers to perform that functionality. Couldn't you just build that functionality on top of BRC20's like standards, like the functionality of standards like deployments, minting, and transfer? Like, can't you add more functions to that and then just have other indexers catch up to you because you are adding functionality to BRC20? Or am I thinking about this completely wrong?
Because that's a good question, but because you would be overlapping with plans of others, right?
Right.
We don't know what the plans are until they are out. You would have an overlap, and then it would get really messy if these indexers suddenly need to start start to include something that some other party made for it, right?
Okay.
And then the actual decision maker or makers behind BRC20 come up with their own stuff. It will get really messy. But what you have is existing infrastructure for BRC20. Yeah, and if we rewire our brains a little bit and take it as looking at it like like a side chain within ordinals, quote unquote, right? You have you have the existing infrastructure. All you need to do is clone that, make a few modifications, and then it's absolutely nicely separated, and you're not stepping on each other's foot here. Yeah. So that is basically why I believe it's not a good idea to interfere with that. Yeah.
Who are the decision makers in BRC20?
I guess Domo it is, right? He's the main person there. He originated from that. And to less of my knowledge, he went with Alex Labs, I believe, to build something. So I believe that there's, of course, a working group that works things out, right, and does all sorts of things and makes all sorts of decisions. But who it exactly is, I don't know myself.
Okay, yeah, because I was wondering, because typically when something like a concept of BRC20 comes out and it gets traction, and I feel like it's up to the community to add functionality to it, or really it's up to the indexers to recognize additional functionality coming from the BRC20 ecosystem. But I see your point. In order to really accelerate the speed of development in like the fungible space, just come up with your own protocol that you control as an indexer, and then you just add functionality as the functionality is needed, right? And you don't have to necessarily wait for any other BRC20 indexers to come on board because you're doing this on BRC20. Instead, you create your own meta protocol and you just build on top of that and hopefully get traction from there.
Hope of course to get traction there, but it's not just about that. It's literally that that we're having a phase of BRC20 right now where people expect more to happen. And that includes not just people who minted and traded stuff, but it also includes developers like me. So and also to emphasize the respect to BRC20, I think it's important that certain aspects, like with tickers, right, that you're simply not overlapping with them, because BRC20 is and stays the main, right? It's like you would say this EVM chain should replace Ethereum, for example, which is not. It wouldn't make any sense, right? So, and to some extent, that is applicable here too, right?
So, okay, so let me paint you a scenario that could happen. Let's say TAP protocol takes off and like there's some functionality within the TAP protocol that makes sense for BRC20. You could envision a future where Domo comes back and say, you know, what they did in TAP protocol, I like it. Let's implement it for BRC20 and just essentially just do what they did, but enable it on BRC20. Is that technically a possible situation that could occur?
Oh, it's definitely a possibility. You know, can never say no, right? My understanding was just that that the tech Alex Labs is working on is based on stacks. Yeah, that doesn't exclude changes within the protocol aside from stacks, right? But if it's like exactly that, I don't know. It's also about it's also about who is basically looking at things there, right? So I'm not so sure how the plans are for BRC20. I assume some specs will come out at some point, when new specs, when there are updates, for different use cases. But it's similar to smart contract development. On the TAP protocol side, it's basically imprinted in the DNA that the community is not just answering the question what is supposed to get upgraded on the TAP protocol, but the implementation. So it happens very often in EVM, EVM-related ecosystems or general smart contracts, that things are, because of tight timelines and stuff, things are getting rushed out, right? And then you have like a couple of tired developers, right? Who then last second, get changes, which can then get changes to be made that can have catastrophic consequences, because simply not enough eyes are looking at them, right? So, and the TAP protocol works in that way, that also the implementation is being voted on. This means there's a process coming up that enables other people to look at actually what you want to put into that, into that particular part of the tracking, and then it's available as open source, and everybody can basically execute that, and compare the results. So I don't know if for BRC20 something similar is in the works. I have zero idea, but that's actually one of the most important aspects of the TAP protocol, right?
Yeah, and the only reason why I ask is because I just want to understand technically what the functionality is really dependent on indexers, right? So like if Domo comes back and say, let's enable another function on BRC20 besides the 3, the indexers need to update their indexing process to account for this new functionality. And that's how new functions are introduced, right? And so I just wanted to understand, like, that is how it works. Can you confirm?
That is, well, with BRC20, it's because of this 3-tier layered transferable, available, and balance system that you have there. It can be a little bit tricky. If you introduce something that changes the anything in the balances, right? And you have indexes that don't implement that.
I see.
Then you could have an issue. That's why I assume, and that's also what's intended for the TAP protocol, and everybody will need to do it who's doing protocol updates, is to have first a grace time period.
Sure. I gotcha. So did you know that we're more than just a YouTube channel?
We also built MetaZone, the first app store for the metaverse.
Buy, sell, and explore a new class of digital assets like our flagship game Rovi.ai.
Support us by collecting your digital assets through MetaZone at metazone.io.
Like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated.
Back to the video.
That brings up to the next point. I was listening to the Ordinals Revolution podcast that you were on just recently. And so shout out to Ordinals Revolution. So the question that I have is that why you're thinking about potentially coming out with your own TAP protocol wallet?
I think I don't know what exactly I said, but I wouldn't rule it out. I believe I said.
Yeah, correct. You're thinking about potentially doing that.
Yeah, at this time it's simply too much, right? So, and that's also very important. It's a TAP protocol. That has been put out by me. That has been implemented by Trac, of course, being the first tracker doing that. But I do not really want to cannibalize the entire space, already.
Yeah, and I only mentioned that because, like you were saying, if BRC20 were to make an update, right, there's a new functionality. All the indexers and all the wallets, they all have to make their own updates to support this new functionality. And so then I was thinking, it's like, well, if Benny has this TAP protocol with this new functionality, it just makes sense for him to create his own wallet so that wallet supports all this new functionality.
So what's the scenario where the other indexers don't actually, follow along? Basically, there's a I don't want to use the word monopoly, but basically there is a monopoly on functionality, right? Like for the Trac ecosystem, like developers who are building on top of this, and if they're associated to any other indexer that's not, kind of like moving along with this new threshold, they're basically being left behind, right?
Yeah, pretty much, I would think.
So that's kind of like the dynamic here, is right? Introduce this new functionality, this new, I guess, standard approach how you still have that root to BRC20, but you can still leverage this new indexing mechanism.
Yeah.
Like the product of that should be so like much more, I guess, more utility, more marketability to whatever it is. These ecosystems that will emerge from that, right? So it's kind of like a consensus will form around that over time. Is that the expectation? Because there's no way to force other indexers to do anything, right?
Correct.
So it's just a matter of
it's similar. You're right, totally. It's similar to chain forks. Yeah, so the miners can follow, but they don't have to follow, right? So the way I updated that recently too, because I was thinking about it too. I think a good way when you nail it down just to token balances, right, is to say, hey, you have two options. You either implement the whole protocol, or you take the account balancing from existing indexes that implemented that, right? Mm-hmm. So, and that's an ideal solution, for example, within Trac, because you can do that with Trac, right? Yeah. Okay, at the moment, it's just an endpoint, it's centralized and everything, but as soon as it's out, it's not anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So all you need to do then there is, when you're just interested in account balancing stuff, right, and don't want to deal with all that other stuff that's implemented, you just need to take that part of the account balancing and check that with your own indexing, right, to make sure that you're on the same page, right? Yeah. So I think it's gonna go into that direction. Yeah, and this would then include marketplaces, wallets, centralized, decentralized marketplaces. Yeah, basically everything that on the token side that deals with account balancing. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Of course, when it's a little bit easier when you deal with things that are not tokens. Right. Mm-hmm. So basically, where there's no account balancing included, other than who was, for example, who was the first, right? Who, some shape or form, of course, balancing, like who owns what. Mm-hmm. But these are all in things that you can get information through other means without changing everything within your implementation.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting because if you're trying to innovate in the space and you're an indexer, you pretty much if you're an indexer, you're pretty much the smart contract. You are the functionality. You manifest the functionalities, you support those functionalities, and all of a sudden, that BRC20 or the TAP tokens, they inherit that functionality as long as you support it. So that is the I guess the part about Bitcoin ordinals that is different to in comparison to like the smart contract worlds of Ethereum and others.
Yeah.
Benny, can you explain what a tap punk is and how it works?
Yeah, that's really funny. That's also where everybody had a blast with. So first and foremost, it's not part of the TAP protocol. It is a way to utilize the ticker of the TAP protocol because it has this up to 32 symbols length, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then there was this guy I also mentioned in Ord Revolution, Solkek W on Twitter, who started to inscribe just punk underscore and then the punk number, right? Mm-hmm. And then while I was watching what's happening, then others did that too, and then it totally escalated. And what they did was basically they were deploying a token, giving that the name, and then minting, giving it the name punk, and then minting it. Okay, so far so good. Got totally out of hand, and then people started to do that with other things. And I said, hey, wait, stop here, right? Because there's one thing like to do it like with punks, right? But if you continue like that, you're just claiming to own what you don't really have the provenance over the punk, right?
Right.
So then was thinking how to address this, and then I came up with the tap art prefix for tickers that you can basically use to in a similar way then how you would track, let's say, a collection that you want to identify, within ordinals through text inscriptions, to identify that is actually supposed to be something that is linked with an ordinal, right? So, and then prepared there a little bit within the code that basically does these checks, and but outside of the protocol, and link that basically then together with that ordinal. So it's a simple tap art prefix underscore, and you can give it some name, freestyle underscore, and then the inscription number, that you want to connect it with. There is also an alternative link prefix, because it's actual linking. And then I told them, look, guys, you do not own, you don't have the provenance for the image you're linking. So all I can offer you is put a little emoji there, a link emoji there, so that just says it's linked, right? And if you want, I can write a tracker that recognizes them basically if you also own that ordinal, for that linked one, and then you get a verification, mark, basically. They love this kind of stuff. But for punks, we're treating differently. I also have the opinion you need to appreciate that there were already, I think at that point, there were already 5,000 people inscriptions. No, actually 10,000 inscriptions because of the deployment. And you cannot just tell them, look, you just did that for nothing, right? So it was the first of its kind that led to this tap art prefix. So, and then we basically said within the community, these are specials. These get a crown. These are the first in that way being inscribed on the tap protocol. But that's it. From now on, please use tap art, so it's not going to get inflationary. To that point. That's something that everybody agreed on, because otherwise you will just have I don't know, tens of thousands of useless tokens, being inscribed that are not even worth an inscription anymore to people, so it's something like that you need to address early on, so it's not becoming a problem later. And with tap art, the tap art prefix, we also have basically the the precursor of fractionalized ordinals, on Taproot, because of course these are tokens, right? They are linked with an ordinal. If it happens, you own the ordinal behind it. It's something with value, can also be sets, sitting in that ordinal. Can be art, can be anything. Community needs to make sense of it, not me. But you have a way of basically saying, okay, I can prove provenance by showing that I own both. And I fractionalize that through the supply of that token behind it, right? What people make of it is their thing, right? They can potentially lock it up in multi-signatures and stuff like that, the art, to protect the value behind the ordinal. But it seems like that something simple like this can emerge into something more interesting pretty quickly.
I totally agree. Yeah, and this is the value of having someone like Benny be part of the ecosystem, and on top of that, Benny happens to be running an indexer, enabling new functionality to fungible tokens. All of a sudden, there's like this potential fractionalization option for people who hold the provenance. Right now, they can fractionalize something.
Yeah, I'm wondering, like, that's a good already like flagship showcase of like what has been enabled, right? Through Benny's contributions. But I'm wondering, considering like where we are in this ordinal space and how much is lacking overall because we're not operating under these frameworks of smart contracts and stuff to bring in more like programmability to this ecosystem. How much more infrastructure is left outside of like solidifying the decentralized indexing space and figuring out the right, I guess, like implementations of how do I associate the right functions to this indexing information process? Like, what else is lacking? Are there enough developers within the ordinal space right now addressing the missing components of this infrastructure? Or
ultimately, Benny, let's say if Benny was the only indexer in the space, are we to rely on you to do everything, or how do we how do we get like equal participation from all indexers to like index the same thing?
Yeah, I hope it's not just Trac. I hope it's not just me. Yeah, because that would not be healthy for the market
or for you.
For me too, of course. Yeah, in a physical sense, anyway.
Yeah.
But I see a lot happening in the future when it comes to initiatives to streamline the different aspects. I just yesterday I was thinking like, my God, we're doing all this stuff based on JSON, right? So, but there are three main JSON specific RFCs in play, right? If you're not using the right RFC, for your JSON, right, I can have catastrophic consequences, right? So I'm just like I'm using like the most recent one, right? But these are things like that need to be fleshed out, right? It needs to say basic. There needs to be an instance similar to let's say an EIP, for the space. That defines such things. Otherwise you will at some point when it's getting more complex, we're running into issues, definitely, and that's where everybody needs to meet. Ideally, not in form as decision makers, but maybe as in form of consultancy, and then telling an independent entity the point of views, and that independent entity then decides actually what is standard and what is not, right? And I think that this should come, right? So the community had the idea to already to have a tip, what they call it, tap improvement proposals, right, within the protocol. Could make sense, I don't know, but something like improvements like this will at some point be required to make it in the ordinal space, especially for tracking.
Yeah, because ultimately it's going to be as simple as a GitHub repository of all the protocols and all the functionalities all being agreed upon by, I guess, the community. And what is agreed upon is supported by the indexers, a part of the ecosystem. And so the APIs being used by developers to the indexers are the indexers who are the fastest to provide the information, right? It's all about now. Benny has to figure out the right, tech stack in order to provide the information that developers like us need in the fastest way, because he's competing with all these other indexers, right? And then we're supposed to pay for those API calls so that Benny could put some food on the table, right? So
you're not paying API calls for Trac.
No, correct. You're not paying for API calls today, but eventually you're going to have to monetize, because you can't do this for free forever. Right. So.
Sorry to interrupt you on that, but there will be for sure enterprise support.
Yep.
But Trac is not going to charge individual developers for data that's basically freely available in the network. So that's probably a difference to other indexers potentially.
Sure. And the whole point is that what you're doing is extremely valuable to the community. And the only way to sustain is to figure out some monetization method for you to like sustain your activity, right? So the enterprise makes a lot of sense, but like independent developers, they should be able to use your API calls, and once they start doing like 100,000 API calls per day, then it's like enterprise time, and you got to pay. So that makes a lot of sense. I had one of the last questions. We have about 2 minutes left, Benny. I wanted to talk about parceling, but I don't think we have enough time to talk about that. So do you want to, parceling specifically for bitmaps, but do you want to talk about anything that you're working on that you want the audience to kind of know about and anticipate, or anything that you want anybody to know about?
You mean in regards to parcels?
No. In regards to Trac. And what you're working on, because I wanted to talk about parceling, but I don't think we have enough time.
Okay, understood. Yeah, just didn't get it at first. So Yeah, I'm working on right now on liquidity pools within the TAP protocol.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not gonna not 100% work, like, because it's not necessary like liquidity pools on Ethereum, simply because there are no smart contracts involved. So it's not gonna be like trying to mimic that. Yeah, but it's gonna be liquidity pools. Yeah. So that's what I'm working on right now, and also have some plans for the governance, because said in the also in the Trac community, which has now an overlap with TAP, which, well, by the way, needs to get sorted too. That these are then two different. That it's clear that these are two different things, right? But anyway, that that there need to be like at least a couple of strong features being implemented within the TAP protocol before it goes to governance. So which then is the first thing on is then basically liquidity pooling, and the second will be will be governance part.
So the liquidity pools, that's to be able to swap TAP tokens with each other. Is that correct?
It's an internal, it's a purely internal thing, of course, but through this external part, there is at least a way available to basically bring things in and bring things out. Yeah, in some value. It's not direct liquidity, of course, right? But you have an interface. You basically have an interface to the outside world, and then internally you can go wild. Yeah, so that's what you can actually do there. Neat idea probably for marketplaces would be to make this process transparent between the different protocols that are similar. I don't to shift basically to shift the value. I don't like to say liquidity, but shift the value of the different protocols between the different protocols in a transparent way. Yeah, for the user, there's probably an idea that maybe, I don't know in what time in the future marketplaces would allow for, but that's the layer where I would see, for example, how you can shift the different assets between the protocols.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, obviously liquidity is going to be like the single most important thing, and to enable everything DeFi. And if you're gonna be focusing on that, then TAP protocol might be like something interesting for people to pay attention to.
Yeah, 1,000%. I think that's like the natural expectation right now of like, you're already seeing like the whole like ordinals are dead memes starting to spread, because I mean, everyone's sitting on the sidelines waiting for this DeFi era to emerge, right? Just like, you know, the meme token economy can only go so far, right? We need these functions. We need like the financialization of everything to kind of like enter this space, right? And until something like TAP, and, you know, we talked to the Oshi team working on Boss protocol last week. As far as we know, these are the two, and I guess what's going on with Alex Labs, whether or not everyone's going to just migrate to layer 2 to do all these things is to be determined. But without a doubt, that is the state of where we are as like an Ordinals community. Who is going to crack this code first, right? And where is DeFi going to happen? And once the TVL metrics start to come in, we see that, you know, that exponential growth.
Yeah,
then we could actually, like, you know, start rawing about something, right?
Yeah.
No, let's see what happens. But
so no pressure, Benny. No pressure at all on you whatsoever.
No. I just like to call this OrdFi in this case for TAP.
I like that.
Because it's not DeFi. Yeah,
beautiful. So, already you're in the lead.
It will look different than the usual DeFi stuff. So there needs to be a distinction to be made, because it's simply the fact that's different.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, it's not going to operate. The mechanisms will be different, but it's. I agree. I align with. We have to create as much distinguishability, I guess, between, you know, what's happening on Bitcoin ordinals, what happened already in the past with Ethereum.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah, because it's not DeFi, because DeFi is Ethereum based. This is Bitcoin, right? This is something different.
Totally agree. OrdFi. I'm all in on that.
Yeah, same.
Hashtag OrdFi. Start spreading it on Twitter right now.
Yeah. All right, Benny. Thank you so much for joining us, man. I wanna have you back on to focus a little bit more on bitmaps, just because it's really interesting, like from our personal point of view, just to have like the metaverse deployable on top of Bitcoin, right?
Yeah.
I also want to talk about a little bit more details of like getting parceling going, as far as like if I want to inscribe one of your parcels, I feel like I should be able to. And so that's really going to be dependent on like an indexer supporting such functionality, right? So eventually, hopefully we get you back on to talk about that kind of stuff. But again, thank you, Benny, for joining us. I really appreciate you and like explaining everything about indexing, because it's new for us, like coming from the Ethereum space. Like this isn't something that we get exposed to a whole lot, just because it was kind of taken care of for the most part in like the Ethereum space when we were in it. But yeah, just your explanations were very helpful. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you guys and have this nice conversation, and hope see you soon. Talk to you soon.
Yeah. All right. Appreciate it, Benny. We'll talk to you soon, man. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.